Aeroflight 593, where Innocence takes a terrifying turn at 30,000 feet. Forget the usual turbulence. Imagine a group of kids holding the fate of the plane and its passengers in their tiny hands. Join us on this hair-raising journey as we unravel the events that led to the unthinkable, a catastrophic crash into the unforgiving Russian mountains. This isn't your average in-flight disturbance. This story will send shivers down your spine. So find yourself an aisle or window seat and skip that middle one for this unforgiving tale. We're going to take a turbulent ride through the skies over Russia. Welcome to Destination-Aviation. Well, welcome to either your first or let's hope one of many Destination Aviation podcasts. I am your host, Jeff, coming to you from a sunny Illinois. It's actually kind of, I don't know if it's an Indian fall, Indian summer. I don't know the term, but you know what I'm saying. It's warm out. It's nice for November in the north. So my mother actually is making the incredibly smart decision to move from sunny Florida to Ohio in the winter. She's coming up in December, so I think she's lost her marbles somewhere along the way. But shout out to my mother, who is a listener. I would have probably the worst podcast in the world if I can't get my own mother to listen to it. Mom, I hope you are enjoying your trip up to Ohio. Just remember to pack a jacket. And thank you for listening to this. She did say to me that she listens to my podcast when she's going to sleep. So I don't know if I should take that as a compliment or if I should take up an issue with that comment. I'm going to take it as a compliment. If you want to go to sleep while you're listening to me, that's fine. Just remember to hit the subscribe button before you zonk out for the night. So I wanted to touch on this briefly as we talk a little bit about things that are in the news up front. I don't know if you saw China has asked for all of their pandas back. So I saw this video online. If you haven't looked, it's a FedEx flight of them loading pandas up onto the FedEx plane. So FedEx actually has livery of a panda on one of their aircraft, and they use that to ship the pandas back to China. Boeing 777. It's actually the video I found was 2 hours long. I did not watch the 2 hours. I watched some of the loading, and then I watched, obviously, the departure. But the pandas that were in the DC Zoo since, I think, early 2000s are on their way back to China as part of, unfortunately, the unraveling of relations between us and China. So, unfortunately, the pandas are back, but it seemed like they were riding a comfort cruise on FedEx back to their homeland. So I had seen videos in the past, everybody probably has, of pandas sitting in first class, bamboo on the list, right? So, but I thought that was kind of a cool little neat story. I mean, it's not cool they're leaving. I think everybody would like to see them. If I remember right from the story, there's still one panda down around Atlanta. But you're not finding them in the DC area or I think anywhere else. I think it was just one zoo left that has a panda in it. So go see your panda soon before you have to make a trip to China to find them. So we had talked about before North Dakota Senator Doug Larson and his family that unfortunately passed away by Moab in a plane crash. There was a little further out now from the National Transportation Safety Board. Since we talked about it initially, we would just fill in some of the pieces there. According to the report from the NTSB, the aircraft collided with a hill shortly after takeoff before crashing into the ground about a half mile away from the runway. At the time of the takeoff roll, the pilot-controlled runway lights were not illuminated. Security footage showed the aircraft Piper PA-28-140 landing at the Canyonlands Regional Airport in Moab, Utah around 5:47 p.m. An FBO employee stated he saw the pilot take on 27 gallons of fuel from a self-serve fuel island before parking the aircraft and borrowing a courtesy car for a few hours. The report states that 4 occupants returned and boarded the plane around 8:11 p.m. A witness reported it was very dark outside with no illumination from the moon. The witness said that the aircraft took off, it banked steeply to the right, and then appeared to lose altitude. ADS-B data corroborated the witness's statement, showing the aircraft climbed 200 feet during the right turn after takeoff before descending. According to the NTSB, an examination, the engine revealed no mechanical malfunctions or failures that would have precluded normal operations. A clear indication of what caused the crash is not available. It's also interesting they didn't illuminate the lights. I'd be curious if the pilot control lighting was not working or they just decided not to turn it on. I know all of us probably that have flown have seen pilots do that before. I can't say I've done it, but I have seen pilots leave without turning the lights on. Moonless night, engine seems to be operating normal. Was it similar to what we have seen in other experiences where there was a loss of maybe the horizon? So continue to follow this story as the NTSB report comes out, as we try to do with these episodes. If there's things all of us can learn that either fly or that we're interested in because we're listening to this podcast, those are the things hopefully that will get us out of any situations down the road. Our story today actually has a little bit of some spatial disorientation that's similar to what happened here on a moonless night, taking off from this airport if, they were disoriented. So be curious to see. Could also be a weight and balance issue. 27 gallons on board. It sounded like, it was a full aircraft. So maybe there was an issue there. We will continue to follow that story. Just got done with a meeting on Transportation Security Administration clearances. We are coming up on the busiest travel day of the season. The TSA, if you saw David Petoskey, he's the head of the TSA. He's been hitting the morning news cable channels, morning network channels to basically say that it's going to be a busy holiday travel season, what they are anticipating to be a record, all-time record. Last year, they were projecting just under 2.9 million passengers. This year, TSA is projecting just over 2.9 million passengers. So if you find yourself traveling over this busy holiday season, listen to Destination-Aviation as you go to your destinations, but please make sure to get there ahead of time, as it sounds like it's going to be quite busy. And another fun item, Congress seems to be gridlocked on a reauthorization or a continuing resolution to fund the federal government. So we are sitting 5 days from the government shutdown, which of course your TSA officials and your FAA officials, your air traffic controllers, they will all still be working, but they will be working out without immediate pay. Doesn't mean that they ultimately won't get paid. They're just not going to get their paychecks until the government squares that all away. Mike Johnson had sent over some laddering approaches to FAA, TSA, Customs and Border Protection, different dates that they would run out of funding. It sounds like he needs to keep at least 4 representatives to get this to pass, 4 Republican representatives, as none of the Democrats sound like they're going to vote for it. He already doesn't have 4 of them, so it's not looking good. The Democratic-controlled Senate has said that they will not take any cuts in funding for these government agencies, so it will be interesting. Mike Johnson's resolution does follow the 2023 limits for federal funding for these agencies, so that's probably a good for Democrats. It sounds like he may have a little more leeway than Kevin McCarthy did. However, it doesn't seem like there is a great pathway forward right now. Busiest travel day ever, TSA is predicting, and they may not be getting paid, at least immediately. Ultimately, they eventually do get paid back up whenever the government decides to approve the funding, but you can imagine if you're a federal employee that not getting your paycheck immediately turns into probably frustration, sick outs, things of that nature, the longer it goes on. The federal government is quick to turn around to these employees and say, here, give this note to your mortgage company or whatever. Tell them you're not getting paid, which, as you know, would probably go over great with any mortgage company. If they're not getting paid, you may have some grumpy federal employees out there. And lastly, I'll bring up here, just because some friends had sent it over in text messages, Lance Air that overshot the runway in McKinney, Texas. Fortunately, nobody was hurt. But if you haven't gotten on YouTube and watched this video, it's kind of crazy. Just there was a guy, I guess, picking up an aircraft off to the side that he was putting on a trailer and happened to be filming. But this Lance Air landed, overran the runway at the Arrow County Airport in McKinney, Texas, and collided with a car on the road adjacent to the airport. Pilot told authorities the prop wouldn't reverse. The pilot reported a pressurization problem. When climbing through 25,000 feet and descended rapidly to make an emergency landing, it went around on the first landing attempt and then overran the runway. Plane is registered in Midland, Texas. Like I said, you get on YouTube, go watch this video. The Lance Air in McKinney, Texas. It shows it bouncing off and striking a car. Lucky thing, the occupants of the car and the aircraft, it was all just minor injuries, but crazy to see that and live. Somebody just happens to be there filming and capturing it. So excursions are real. That's why most airports try to, at least if you're regulated by the FAA 1,000 feet beyond each end of the runway. It didn't look like, obviously, they had that space here at all. It looked like the road was pretty much right there. We have seen modification to standards and runway design, especially at non-commercial airports, which McKinney would be that. So onward and out to our story at hand. We've probably all been on an aircraft where, maybe the kid in front of you is crying, the unconsolable wailing, or maybe the parents just decide to ignore it because they decided to have kids, and it's your pleasure to get to hear them while you fly. I kid. But sort of. We all get on the plane, and anybody can say, oh, it's what kids do. But the consistent wailing, especially on a long flight, geez, that's really annoying. I was on a flight to Phoenix a couple of months ago, and there was a kid in front of me for the majority of the flight. I like a window seat. Later on in life now, I sacrifice the window seat to be able to control my destiny to the bathroom rather than getting two people up. United was fortunate enough for me to switch my seat without telling me, even though I booked it ahead of time, to a window seat. And the kid in front of me threw his baby bottle, his pacifier, Cheerios, you name it, at me throughout the flight, which inadvertently caused me to have to pass everything back, and then later on get hit in the face with it again at some interval. Not necessarily blaming the kid. The parents didn't really seem to care. It's kind of, like I said, we had kids, so enjoy getting hit in the face. But that's air travel these days. If I wanted to avoid it, I should fly corporate. I should fly private. Unfortunately, I can't afford that, so unless I'm sitting in my 172 and from Chicago to Phoenix, I don't know what, maybe that would be more enjoyable than getting hit in the face with a bottle. We all get on an aircraft and we have those kids in the plane and they're yelling and they're screaming and they're ripping stuff up and they're running up and down and we're all supposed to find it cute. But what if those kids actually killed you? Right? Nobody ever thinks about that. I know I wouldn't have crossed my mind, but that leads us to our flight today. A listener actually brought this suggestion to me, so thank you to the listener. I had not heard of this story from Aeroflight, but it was actually the pilot's kids that were the downing of this aircraft. So as I started looking into it, one interesting, I had mentioned this before, we're getting a lot more of listeners from Asia. We hear people chiming in from India quite a bit, which is great. So we had the Nepal story, and then now we have a Russian story. So this whole kind of incident takes off through Russia, heading towards China, or, I guess what would have been, at the time, Hong Kong. It's kind of a captivating story. It's an interesting story. So let's talk a little bit about Aeroflight 593. The aircraft involved in the accident was a leased Airbus A310-304. Now, this is a time period where the Soviet Union has just deconstructed itself. Russia is emerging more as a Western country. Kind of weird to where we are now, obviously, right, where everything has kind of changed and they reverted back to what they were. But at this time, the Iron Curtain had fallen. They were looking more towards Western technology. The state-owned Aeroflight had just Russian-made aircraft, and this was their first attempt into purchasing a Western-built aircraft, which was the Airbus A310-304, with a registration of Foxtrot, Oscar, Golf, Quebec, Sierra. It was delivered to Aeroflot on December 11th, 1992. The airframe had its maiden flight on September 11th of 1991. And was one of 5 operating Russian International Airlines, an autonomous division of Aeroflot that was set up serving routes from the Russian Far East to the Southeast Asia. On an average, between the 3 crew members operating this flight, they had an average of 900 hours in the A310-304. Interesting to note at this time, domestic flights within Russia were not making very much money, so it was the international flights that really made up for all the domestic flying within Russia. And this was a popular flight. Of the 63 passengers on board, 40 were Russian nationals, including about 30 airline employees and family members. The remaining 23 foreigners were mostly businessmen from Hong Kong and Taiwan, who were looking for economic opportunities in Russia. The captain of the flight, 593. Now, I'm just going to say up front here, this is going to be a scenario that tests Jeff's ability to pronounce Russian names. So, take it with a grain of salt or a silo of salt. So, the captain of Flight 593 was Andrei Danilov, who was hired by Aeroflot in November of 1992. He had over 9,500 hours of flight time, including 950 hours in this A310. Of which 895 hours were as captain. The first officer, Igor Piskarovo, was hired by Aeroflot in October of 1993, had 5,885 hours of flight time, including 440 hours in the Airbus A310, and the relief captain was Yaroslav Kredinsky, who was hired by Aeroflot in November of 1992. He had over 8,940 hours of flight time, including 907 hours in the A310. There were 9 flight attendants on board the aircraft as well. Shortly after midnight on March 23, 1994, the aircraft was en route from Sheremetyevo International Airport in Moscow to Katek Airport in Hong Kong. With the 75 occupants on board, 63 of which were passengers, relief pilot Kredinsky was taking his 2 children on their first international flight. After the flight was established, nighttime and they're flying, the 2 kids were brought to the flight deck while Kredinsky was flying. At this point, there were 5 people on the flight deck. So at this point, it's nighttime, they've established a flight, they're going from Moscow, they're going to Hong Kong. It's a later flight, it's a red-eye, and they bring the children up to the flight deck to show them the new Airbus A310 that Russia has acquired. After 9/11 in the United States, the in-flight tours of a flight deck were discontinued. So in the United States, if the aircraft is in flight, they can't open the door to allow somebody in on a commercial flight. Other countries, it varies. It's up to the captain. But one of the interesting things that happens here, and you'll hear in a moment, is manipulation of the flight controls. That is a kind of cross-the-board no-no, especially on a commercial airliner flight. With the autopilot active, Kredinsky, against regulations, let his children sit at the controls. Yana, who was his daughter, took the pilot's left front seat 43 minutes past midnight. Kredinsky adjusted the autopilot heading to give her the impression she was turning the plane, though she actually had no control of the aircraft. Shortly thereafter, at 51 past midnight, Elder occupied the pilot's seat. This would be his son, Kredinsky's son. Unlike his sister, Elder applied enough force to the control column to contradict the autopilot for 30 seconds. So, going back, it's midnight. You have 2 children in the flight deck. You have the co-pilot, Piskarov, in the right seat. You have Kredinsky's 2 children, his daughter, and then later his son, switching in and out from the pilot seat while he stood behind, controlling the aircraft while he turned the autopilot to give the illusion that they were turning. His daughter let the controls do what they wanted to. His son adjusted the controls and was counteracting what the autopilot was doing. Just under 4 minutes after his son Elder occupied the pilot seat, his action caused the flight computer to switch the plane's ailerons to manual control. This was unbeknownst to any of the crew members, though. While maintaining control over the other flight systems, Elder was now in partial control of the aircraft. A silent indicator light came from an alert to the pilots of this partial disengagement. The pilots who had previously flown Soviet-designed planes that had audible warning signals apparently failed to notice the indicator light. All right, so we're moving forward. We have the son who's counteracting the autopilot. The autopilot disengages because it assumes the pilot is doing something else versus what the input was put into the autopilot. Now in this Airbus A310, you have the ailerons, the elevators, and the rudders all independent on the autopilot system. So the rudder and the elevators are still under autopilot control, but the ailerons now are under control of a 15-year-old. Now the son, Elder, remember again, 15-year-old son at the controls of this Airbus A310, he's the first to notice a problem. He observed that the plane was banking right. Shortly after, the flight path indicator changed to show the new flight path of the aircraft as it turned. Since the turn was continuous, the resulting predicted a flight path drawn in the screen of a 180-degree turn. This indication is similar to shown when aircraft is in a holding pattern. We've probably all been in that. When I had mentioned this in a previous podcast, when I was going to Las Vegas, we got put into a holding pattern outside of Harry Reid International Airport. Ha, Jeff, it's never going to be called McCarran. Remember that story? Jeff was laughed out of the room because I said they were going to call it Harry Reid. Okay. Jeff, let it go. Yes, I will. So we're in a holding pattern outside Harry Reid International Airport. Basically, right, looking like a NASCAR racetrack. You're basically just going in a circle until you're released. So that's what it looks like is happening on this aircraft now. It's past midnight. The sun notices they're turning a different way than the autopilot had in place. The autopilot's now kicking it to look like a holding pattern. Everybody's confused. The pilots of this confusion were in that state for 9 seconds, during which time the plane banked past a 45-degree angle, almost to 90 degrees. This was steeper than the design of the aircraft allowed. So now they're in an uncontrollable turn. The A310 cannot turn this steeply while maintaining altitude, and the plane started to descend quickly. The increased G-forces on the pilots and crews made regaining control extremely difficult for them. So now you're in a situation where you're in a steep dive, you've turned the aircraft to almost 90 degrees, and the pilots have 2 times the force of their own weight pushing them back. The only person at the controls now is a 15-year-old. and he's trying his best to understand what the heck is going on. The captain himself is pinned to the back of the flight deck, and everybody, of course, in the back of the plane now knows something serious is going on up front. Unbeknownst to any of them, they don't know the children were taking up there, right? Because it's past midnight, you're probably sleeping, or you're not paying attention if somebody's walking up with crew members. The autopilot, which no longer controlled the ailerons, used its other controls to compensate, pitching the nose up and increasing thrust. As a result, the plane began to stall. The autopilot, unable to cope, disengaged completely. A second, larger indicator light came on to alert the pilots of a complete disengagement. At this time, they did notice it. At the same time, the autopilot's display screen went blank. To recover from the stall, an automatic system lowered the nose and put the plane into a nosedive. The reduced G-forces enabled Kredinsky to retake his seat from Elder. The co-pilot then managed to pull out of the dive, but overcorrected, putting the plane into almost a vertical ascent, again stalling the plane. This caused the plane to enter into a spin. So now we're in a spin scenario, right? What we talked about before, when you stall an aircraft, this was our last conversation, right, of stalling an aircraft we were talking about on an approach with Yeti Airlines. Now they're into a spin, which once again, a stall can lead to a spin. During the spin, Kredinsky managed to almost recover the plane, but he pulled back too aggressively, causing their speed to drop, and then a rudder input sent the plane into a second spin. Only this time they entered a flat spin. Although Kredinsky and his co-pilot managed to regain control again and leveled out the wings, they did not know how far they had descended during the crisis, and their altitude by then was too low to recover. Subsequently, the plane crashed at 58 past midnight in a flat altitude at a high-level vertical speed, estimated at around 160 miles per hour, or 250 kilometers. All 75 occupants died on impact. The aircraft crashed with its landing gear up, and passengers had been prepared for an emergency as they were all strapped into their seats. No distress calls were made before the crash. Despite the struggles of both pilots to save the aircraft, it was later concluded that if they had simply let go of the control column after the first spin, the aerodynamic principles would have caused the plane to return to level flight, thus preventing a crash. There was no evidence or technical failure in the plane. In this case, the pilots tried to control the aircraft for what they couldn't understand was happening and inadvertently put the aircraft directly into the ground. The wreckage was located on a remote hillside on the Kazninska-Alatu mountain chain, about 20 kilometers or 12 miles east of Kemerovo Oblast, Russia. The flight data recorders were found on the second day of searching. Families of Russian victims placed flowers on the crash site, while families of the Chinese and Taiwanese victims scattered pieces of paper with messages written on them around the area. So in this incident, right, the captain was excited. In Russia, being an airline captain was a prominent position. He wanted to show off his new equipment to his children. They did not mean intentional harm, but their actions resulted in the confusion that was happening on the flight deck. And unfortunately, everybody lost their lives due to this. In the aftermath, Aeroflight originally denied that the children in the cockpit, but accepted the fact when a Moscow-based magazine published a transcript on September 28th, 1994. The Associated Press said, according to the transcript, the Russian crew almost succeeded in saving the plane. A transcript of the tape printed in the Russian magazine shows the Russian crew nearly managed to save the Airbus plane and 75 people on board, but that it was hampered by the presence of children and its unfamiliarity with the foreign-made aircraft. So a couple of things with this accident. They went and recreated this environment in a Airbus A310 simulator. Because there was not an audible alarm, one, they said that the pilots probably didn't receive the proper training that they should have on that system. It was just illuminated by a light. There was also some confusion on the autopilot itself and how it generated, the turn to 180 degrees. The pilot's confusion you can hear on the flight deck recorder is they thought they were inadvertently somehow got to a holding pattern. So there was confusion about how the ailerons, the elevator, and the rudders disengaged. There was confusion about the audible alarm. That is just an illumination of light. And then, of course, all of this was started by kids being on the flight deck. When his son inadvertently pushed against the flight deck controls, so he was pushing left aileron to the right aileron that was inputted into the autopilot. After 30 seconds, he disengaged it, and then, unbeknownst to everyone, now the 15-year-old was in charge of the ailerons of the aircraft, which inadvertently led to the steep dive, resulting from almost a 90-degree left turn. So all this confusion that was going on in there were follow-ups. There was better training to crew members that flew the A310 on how the autopilot system worked. And then there are tightening of regulations for people being within the flight deck. Like I said, it depends on the country, but In no case was there ever an approval for people that were not trained to manipulate flight controls. So it at least brought to light some of these practices and hopefully saved some further accidents down the road. I will say, in a limiting fashion, from where we were from 9/11, from where we were from this accident with Aeroflight, I have memories of, I was never invited to a flight deck en route, but as a child, I remember the door being open and being able to look out through the flight deck and see the pilots flying. And I do think that, unfortunately, there is a level, right, that I wish we were still there where people could go and tour the flight deck. Now you have it hardened beyond hardened, and it is a complete no-no, unfortunately, for people. But in my job, at least, we see a lot of things with young eagles and getting students involved in flying. So get them up into, a Cessna 172 or Piper PA-28 or something like that to give them the ability to actually be immersed in aviation, where unfortunately now, especially in the US, what you can really only have is, instances maybe at, a passenger boarding bridge where children can go up and kind of look at the flight deck before the aircraft takes off. So, incidents like this, 9/11, ruin it for the masses, unfortunately, that everything is fine, everything is good. In this case, right, if they would have brought the children up just to see the flight deck, I think in my world, I wouldn't have a problem with that. Obviously, I would have a problem with someone manipulating flight controls that, shouldn't be there. But in this case, a lot of things, went awry, but you can tell from what the father wanted was just to impress his kids. So it's a really unfortunate set of circumstances that happened. And interesting enough now, as I went back and was researching this, right, just where we've changed in a world connective sense from, Russia, Iron Curtain, things are falling down. They're opening up their borders, letting people access to Russia. I mean, Russia was on my list of places I wanted to visit. And then unfortunately, where we are now, it's completely almost reversed back to the Russia that we knew from the 1980s. So it's unfortunate. It's fortunate to see those type of things happen, especially now where, you can tell, like we talked about the Airbus that landed in the airfield that ran out of fuel. Russia is severely hampered now on routes that they can go with their international flights. So they are, predominantly, once again, a domestic flight carrier. I was just reading an article on insurance and how all the insurance premiums are going up around the world because so many Russian aircraft were basically hijacked when the borders closed. They kept aircraft that were on lease that no longer paying on. There's all that stuff, transfer of funds that, restrictions and sanctions put in place. So it just sucks, right? It sucks to see the world in turmoil. It seems like the human race will never get out of its pattern of conflict. So that today will conclude our story Into the Skies. I appreciate you coming along with me on this. Remember to drop me a line at dapodcast85@gmail.com if you wish to share any of your stories in flight. I'm going to try to get one of those together again. Some stuff I've been able to piece together through the email. Don't know when that will come, but eventually I'll get it out there. We do have the stickers on the website. Please remember to subscribe to the channel. Every week we seem to grow with listeners, so I really do appreciate that. Appreciate my mom tuning in. It's about time, Mother, that you tuned in to your son's podcast. No, she's going to tell me I never told her about it. But now she has something to comfort her when she goes to sleep, especially on those chilly Ohio nights. Thank you so much to everybody listening to us today, continuing to listening to the podcast, whether you're doing that through your favorite app or YouTube. I try to get it on all the platforms so people can listen to it in a wide array of listening locations. So thank you so much for that. And until next time, my friends, I will see you down the runway.